This evening, we are very pleased to have with us Michael H. Armacost, Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. Mr. Armacost is traveling with his own public relations agent this evening, since he and our own George Wills are close friends and were White House Fellows in 1969 and 70. So thanks to Mr. Wills, I have learned the following. Mr. Armacost is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service, and during his career has held many significant posts, including Ambassador to the Philippines and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Additionally, Mr. Armacost has served as Senior Staff Member of the National Security Council and for 2 years was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. Mr. Armacost is also the recipient of the State Department's Superior Honor Award and the Defense Department's Distinguished Civilian Service Award. Further, Mr. Armacost has been a lecturer and professor at 4 universities and colleges, including 2 years as a lecturer at Johns Hopkins. Mr. Armacost will address us this evening on the topic of very timely importance, U.S. diplomacy and the search for peace in regional conflicts. It is with great pleasure that I welcome Mr. Michael H. Armacost to the Council.
Thank you very much. I like introductions that are brisk. I went one time to a World Affairs Council in California, and my mother and dad were close by and were invited to come to the meeting, and my father was asked then to make the introduction, whereupon he started working his way through my youth and teenage years and college years and courtship, and was dissuaded from continuing only by my mother, who remembered happily an old H.L. Mencken comment that you don't have to eat the whole sheep to get the taste of mutton. And I'm delighted to be here, delighted to have an occasion also to see our good friends, the Wills. He is a good PR man, and I thought I might put him to work tonight for when we hit a traffic jam out on the end of Wisconsin Avenue. I thought maybe George would be fending for himself up here at 6 o'clock, and know he would have probably done the splendid job that he always does. State Department people have a capacity for circumlocution, and Harold Macmillan probably got it best when he said a diplomat is a man who's constantly and uneasily poised between a cliche and an indiscretion. I will try and position myself comfortably between platitudes and a bad leak for you this evening. I did want to talk about some issues that are occupying much of the Secretary of State's time and others of us who work for him. And I wanted to speak principally of policy opportunities. I think the months immediately ahead are months of special opportunity for us for at least 3 reasons. One is that we have a president who has been reelected, and for the first time, therefore, since our involvement in Vietnam, at least, during the early months of a presidential term, we can concentrate principally upon substance rather than that massive turnover of personnel and the pendular swings of policy which normally accompany the start of administration. By the same token, we're dealing with a new leadership in the Soviet Union. And not only a new leader, they've had 3 and 4 years, but leadership which has passed now to a new generation. And I must say, on the basis of reports today, Mr. Gorbachev has consolidated his position much more rapidly than one might have anticipated. Normally, one would expect that changes of policy would come rather slowly, precisely because a new man, having ascended to the leadership in a system which practices rather brutal politics, would devote his time to positioning his own men for service on the Politburo and the key party committees. Mr. Gorbachev has moved very rapidly. He's already reduced the age in the Politburo by about 10 years by putting 3 of his own men in the current meetings in Moscow. And it's a reminder that, having been close to Mr. Andropov, some of the consolidation of power on behalf of groups that were close to Andropov has been going on for some time, interrupted perhaps by Mr. Chernenko's relatively brief tenure. In any event, we have continuity of leadership. Soviets have new leadership, and we have recently resumed arms control discussions in Geneva. Second factor, in my judgment, is we're better positioned at the moment to capitalize on policy opportunities than perhaps we've been in many years. In Soviet parlance, one would say the correlation of forces has been shifting in our own favor. We have a president with a strong mandate. We have, as a result of increased defense spending over now some years, begun to restore our position in the strategic balance. We have a resilient economy which broadens our own foreign policy options. We have cohesion within our alliance system, having just successfully managed the deployment of intermediate range nuclear missiles into Europe, despite major Soviet efforts to frustrate those decisions of Allied governments. Our ideas, the democracy, the market system, have an unusual degree of currency not only in the Western world but in the Third World as well. Conversely, a new Soviet leadership faces an economy which has tended to resist rapid modernization. Moscow's allies are restless. Its adventure in Afghanistan is a psychological and material drain and has complicated its relations with many Third World countries, non-aligned countries, the Muslim world in particular. The Soviet Union has relatively little to offer countries in the Third World at a time when African nations are struggling with problems of drought and famine. Latin American nations face major debt problems. Countries in the Middle East express a clear desire for peace and reconciliation. They remain a very dangerous adversary. They continue to devote their resources preponderantly to military enterprises, but they do share with us, we hope, a vital interest in avoiding nuclear war. The resumption of arms negotiation in Geneva, along with the prospect of meeting with Mr. Gorbachev at some point, offers the promise of a renewed and perhaps more intensive dialogue with the Soviet Union on a full range of issues. We should have no illusions. The Soviets remain a formidable military power with expansionist objectives, yet there is at least a possibility that the new leadership will recognize an interest in better external relations with us and others as it tries to address systemic internal problems. We cannot presume any long-term change in Soviet intentions, but we can seek to engage Moscow in constructive mutual efforts to improve our bilateral relations. The third reason why I believe there are great opportunities is that there are signs of ferment and diplomatic movement in the Middle East, in Central America, and Southern Africa. In each of these regions, we're deeply involved in complex negotiating processes. Our role in each is vitally important. The issues in each negotiation have long proved intractable and may remain so. Yet the benefits to us of a peaceful resolution of those problems are self-evident. We're in a strong position to pursue negotiations in these areas, and our challenge is to transform our strength and our vitality, our ideas into constructive and durable achievements. Let me offer a few brief observations on each of these negotiations. 4 times in the past 12 years, the United States has been called upon successfully to broker peace arrangements in the Middle East. These included 3 Egyptian-Israeli agreements between 1974 and 1979, and a Syrian-Israeli agreement in 1974. Once again, we're being called upon by the states in the area to restore momentum to the process for peace. We have an obvious stake in peace between Israel and its neighbors. A conflict in that region carries the risk of great power confrontation, carries risks for the security of Israel. It can threaten disruption of oil supplies. It holds out the possibilities of expanded political and military opportunities for the Soviet Union and the growth of Islamic radicalism and other threats to friendly governments. The conditions for pursuing peace in the Middle East, happily, have been somewhat encouraging. For one thing, the Israeli government is withdrawing from Lebanon. It has offered to negotiate with Jordan without any precondition. Prime Minister Peres said March 31st, "We are prepared to negotiate unconditionally with a joint Jordanian-Palestinian delegation, a Jordanian delegation or a Palestinian delegation, in our efforts toward an immediate peaceful solution or a solution in stages." King Hussein has defied intimidation from hostile states to work with the Palestinians toward eventual negotiations with Israel. Egypt has been re-entering the mainstream of Arab politics. It has been seeking to broaden the negotiating process. It has been seeking to improve relations with Israel. Iraq, presumably because of the Gulf War, has developed closer relations with moderate Arab neighbors and established full diplomatic relations with us. These developments offer some grounds for cautious optimism. We must not blind ourselves to remaining difficulties. There is a continued reluctance that we see by Arab leaders to negotiate directly with Israel. There are differences within the governments of the area. The peace between Israel and Egypt remains a rather cool peace. Hesitations exist and divisions among the Palestinians that are quite obvious. Syria retains a capacity to play a spoiler's role in any peace process. All these are factors that complicate the effort to arrange direct negotiations between Israel and its neighbors, let alone achieve a successful outcome to such negotiations. It is scarcely surprising that many claim that Israel and its neighbors, if left entirely to their own devices, could not possibly resolve their differences. And the corollary is an insistent request by many parties for active U.S. involvement. Only the United States, they maintain, possesses the influence and the credibility with all the parties to assume the role of honest broker. Under the proper circumstances, we are prepared to assume a more active role. Indeed, for many months, we have been working to create those conditions. Above all, our activities have centered first upon an attempt to facilitate a negotiated withdrawal of Israeli forces from Lebanon. That was the purpose of 3 missions by our able Assistant Secretary Dick Murphy to the region. Our effort failed, largely as a result of Syrian intransigence and disarray in Lebanon. And nonetheless, those withdrawals are proceeding. We have actively encouraged improved Egyptian-Israeli relations, an effort we think is now beginning to bear some fruit. We've also urged Jordan, Israel, to work in parallel to improve the quality of life of the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza as a positive step to build confidence and to strengthen the forces of moderation. We have encouraged King Hussein's initiative with the Palestinians and supported his effort to move towards direct negotiations with Israel. And we've urged other Arab states to play a more active and a more constructive role. On February 11th, King Hussein reached a framework agreement with Arafat, which spoke of negotiations and spoke of a peaceful solution. This may prove to be an important milestone if it facilitates Jordanian entry with appropriate Palestinian representation into direct negotiations with Israel. President Mubarak has put forward ideas to push the peace process along. Dick Murphy is again in the area exploring Mubarak's and others' ideas. The test from our standpoint of the utility of any of these ideas or proposals is whether they facilitate or impede early progress toward direct negotiations between the parties most concerned. Once such negotiations are joined, the positions we take will be those that were set forth by President Reagan in September of 1982. Other parties will bring other negotiating positions. That's natural. The place to negotiate is at the table. and we won't accept attempts to change our positions in advance of negotiations. And it is time that the negotiations commence. If not now, one must ask when. The hard choices must be made by all who desire peace. We remain aware of the difficulties, but we're prepared to play our part, a very active part at that, as others accept their responsibilities. In Central America, the vital interests of the United States have compelled us likewise to take an active role in an equally complex multilateral negotiation. In that region, long-standing problems have ripened to a point where the states of the area recognize that the possibility exists for some comprehensive settlement. At the request of our friends in Central America, we have sought to provide help. While some argue that Nicaragua does not directly threaten the United States, the fact is that it does pose a challenge to important American security interests in the area. The basic problem, we believe, is clear. Nicaragua, with encouragement and substantial support from the Soviet Union and Cuba, has sought to exploit the social, economic, political problems faced by the Central American republics. Over the past 6 years, the Nicaraguan government has established intimate ties with the Eastern Bloc. It has undertaken an arms buildup that vastly exceeds any defense requirements and dwarfs the security forces of its neighbors. It has been supplying logistic support and a command structure for a guerrilla warfare effort in a neighboring country of El Salvador. It has also encouraged armed struggle in Guatemala and Honduras, and trained insurgents for combat in Costa Rica. If the problem is clear, so are our objectives. We seek to promote a regional peace and to promote stability by addressing the needs of our friends and coping with the Nicaraguan problem. In that context, we have sought bipartisan support for a strategy which has these components. First, a major effort to strengthen our friends by substantially increasing economic and security assistance while encouraging rapid growth and democratic political development. Second, we have supported the Contadora negotiating process to define political and security arrangements on the basis of which the regimes and the peoples of the region can develop their own institutions and their economies. Third, we have undertaken a direct dialogue with the parties involved in that process, including Nicaragua, in an effort to inject some life into this multilateral negotiating effort. Finally, we've encouraged democratic reforms throughout the region, including support for the democratic opposition within Nicaragua, which is working for a ceasefire, dialogue, and reform of the country on the basis of a democratic political program. Over the past year, we've seen a good deal of success in some areas, much less in others. Our friends in Central America are significantly stronger. Democratic institutions have shown some vitality under fire in Costa Rica, Honduras, and most notably in El Salvador. President Duarte has initiated some impressive reforms. He has earned an enlarged electoral mandate. He has undertaken a process of reconciliation with his own domestic opponents, that is, Salvadoran guerrilla insurgents. Democracy and dialogue in El Salvador stand in quite marked contrast to the Sandinista government's intransigent refusal to even talk with its democratic opposition, much less begin a genuine process of democratization. Consonant with the undertakings in the Contadora Agreement, the countries of the region have persevered in efforts to achieve a regional settlement, and there has been some progress. In negotiations which proceeded through the summer and fall of last year, notable progress was made in a Contadora Agreement, ACTA as they call it, which was designed to translate into operational treaty language the 21 basic objectives upon which the parties had agreed. We and our Central American friends were concerned with elements of the draft which was completed last September, which did not provide for the simultaneous implementation of all of the security provisions in that agreement. we felt the provisions which provided for movement toward greater democratic reforms were insufficient, and we regarded the verification provisions as being inadequate. Nonetheless, there was positive movement. With the purpose of sustaining and accelerating that movement, we opened in June of last year bilateral discussions with the Nicaraguan government. And there was some evidence that those negotiations were bearing fruit during the summer, perhaps because of anxieties on the part of the Nicaraguan government as to the greater freedom of action and administration that its second term might have. Perhaps stringing a process along in anticipation of elections which it had planned carefully 2 days before our own. In any event, we also perceived a notable loss of interest in substantive discussions in the bilateral talks almost immediately after those November elections, whereas the Nicaraguan government sought to utilize the fact of bilateral talks for the collateral benefit of generating fears among our friends in the region about a side deal with us without carrying on serious talks. We chose to suspend the bilateral discussions and throw the ball diplomatically back into the Contadora court where it now rests. Discussions have been held within the last couple of weeks, the last being April 11th and 12th among vice ministers of the Contadora countries. By all reports, some progress was made in refining further the procedures in the Contadora draft. There remain deficiencies that need to be clearly perfected. Nonetheless, the negotiating process continues. We support that process because its objectives are compatible with our concerns. Ending the arms buildup by Nicaragua, removing Soviet and Cuban and other foreign military personnel from Nicaragua, ending Sandinista support for an insurgency in El Salvador, promoting political pluralism in all countries of the region, including, of course, Nicaragua, in accordance with the promises they themselves made to the OAS and to their own citizens at the time they took power in 1979. The intense regional interest in a settlement, the internal and external pressures on the Sandinistas, and international support for a settlement offer some prospects for progress over the coming months. It is in the context of these events and this evolution that the President's initiative of April 4th should be viewed. He called for a dialogue between the Nicaraguan government and its internal opposition. He called for a ceasefire. He called for greater pluralism and democracy in Nicaragua. In making this proposal, the President's building on the consensus that some form of democratization is essential in all Central American countries, a proposition, incidentally, which has been accepted by all those governments in the 21 objectives which they've signed and is embodied in the Contadora draft treaty, which Nicaragua claimed last October they were prepared already to sign. But democracy is an objective in Nicaragua from our standpoint, not only because it is a value which we cherish at home and would like to foster abroad, but because in the context of any negotiated agreement among the Central American states, confidence that undertakings would be carried out will be much greater if all the governments of the area are subject to democratic procedures of accountability or are subject to some pluralism internally to which they must respond. Consequently, our interest in democratization is not simply a matter of being true to our values, but as an integral element, we feel, in achieving a reliable, verifiable set of security arrangements in the region. We think a comprehensive and patient approach with bipartisan support at home can succeed. We think both incentives and pressures on the Sandinistas are needed. The democratic opposition in Nicaragua deserves our support as an integral part of that broader regional strategy that is aimed at achieving a peaceful settlement. If the Sandinistas come to believe that they're home free, they're under no pressure to compromise with their neighbors, much less their internal opposition, then there'll be no settlement. and there could be a dangerous deterioration of the regional situation. We think that is an undesirable path, and consequently are hopeful that out of the negotiations conducted with the Congress this week, we will secure support for the President's peace plan. Finally, turning to Southern Africa, you are all aware of the intense involvement of the United States in Southern Africa since 1981. That involvement reflects a recognition of an opportunity to promote peaceful change in the region. And I believe we can derive some satisfaction from the role we've played in working toward three key objectives. First, we have promoted peace through the cessation of violence and the removal of foreign forces from the region. Second, we have sought to bring about the independence of Namibia under United Nations Security Council Resolution 435. Third, we have sought to promote peaceful change in South Africa itself, away from a loathsome system of apartheid to a more just society. Our involvement, we think, has already yielded some important benefits. We encouraged the Nkomati Accord between South Africa and Mozambique, the Lusaka Accord between Angola and South Africa. Both of those agreements have helped diminish cross-border violence and have made the point that peace in this region can yield to negotiated solutions. The recent completion of South African withdrawal from southern Angola should also improve prospects for a broader regional settlement. With respect to Namibia, progress has been made in securing agreement to a set of constitutional principles, and the South African government has reaffirmed its commitment to implement Resolution 435 once agreement has been reached on the withdrawal of Cuban troops from Angola. Our effort from the outset has been based, as in other areas, on a sober assessment of the realities in the region and on the understanding that our role must be to encourage a regional peace process, not to try and impose peace from the outside. The African countries, I think, in virtually all cases, have welcomed our involvement and the nature of that involvement. I was delighted to learn that Frank Wisner will be here next week, because Frank and Chet Crocker have been the principal architects of this policy, and I think you will find detailed discussions with him the quite amazing performance that has been rendered by some professional diplomats operating with very little in the way of resources in moving a number of countries with whom we've had relatively little influence in the past toward a serious negotiation. Evidence of this we saw recently when the Angolans presented a Cuban troop withdrawal proposal. This was a major positive development. As differences between Angola and South Africa have narrowed, we have also intensified our own negotiating efforts. Basically, the most recent step was to present to both parties what we've described as a synthesis proposal. It is not an American proposal, but rather we've sought to inject life into the negotiations by taking elements of both parties' positions and sought to move them closer together. We've not heard from either party yet, but the negotiations are in motion, and we hope that our own effort to take a more active and direct role will expedite agreement. Certainly acceptance of a Cuban troop withdrawal formula would be a key element in any settlement. So too would be assurances of Angola's territorial integrity and the implementation of Resolution 435 in Namibia. That kind of package, if it proves possible, will go a long way toward promoting stability in southern Africa. It would also pave the way for the Angolans themselves to achieve national reconciliation without outside interference. We believe the process of change is also underway within South Africa. Its prospects are enhanced by stability and peace in the region. We can and should help to encourage that process in constructive and peaceful directions. The South African government has taken some steps toward reform. These include the establishment of trade union rights, the repeal of the mixed marriage and immorality laws, the cessation of forced removals of black communities, and a pledge to move toward common citizenship for all South Africans. While these steps do go to the core of the doctrine of apartheid, there is still obviously a long and difficult road which must be traveled in order to achieve a just society in South Africa. All Americans, and I think people in the world at large, find the doctrine of apartheid repugnant, the system of apartheid repellent. It is our firm view that the process of peaceful change must continue, and dialogue among all groups in South Africa is essential for this purpose. We make our views known on this subject regularly to the South African government. We do not hesitate to express our views in public, but our policy of constructive engagement is intended to encourage this process, and we believe we can have a greater and more positive influence through that engagement than through a policy of ostracism or isolation, or simply turning our backs and walking away from the problem. We certainly can scarcely serve as an effective broker between the countries of that region if we have no solid relationship with those countries. That's the reason that we have resisted congressional efforts to legislate sanctions against South Africa. A number of legislative proposals have been introduced in the Congress. We have opposed punitive disinvestment legislation since we think that this will impose economic hardship on the black majority, which we're seeking to help. We think it will exacerbate tensions. We do not believe it will promote racial harmony. And passage would certainly jeopardize, we feel, our effectiveness as a mediator in the region without, as I've said, promoting social and racial justice. Congressional votes on the Jackson Plan and support for the democratic resistance in Nicaragua demonstrate as well that the domestic component of negotiations is equally important in Central America. Those who've negotiated with the Nicaraguans, I think, understand the consequences of removing pressure. If support for the resistance is rejected, we suspect Congress will remove an inducement for Nicaragua to contemplate seriously a regional settlement. The same is true in the Middle East, where continued American support for Israel's security is vital. Our support has been systematic, it has been growing, that is well warranted. It is also vital in the sense that it sustains in Israel a level of confidence that enables the government to enter into negotiation with its neighbors in pursuit of a lasting peace. There is no doubt that freedom and peace in the region cannot be achieved unless Israel is strong, and movement on the peace process can only come when there is no doubt of our own commitment to Israel. There shall be none. At the same time, we must recognize that those Arab nations which seek peace are also being asked to assume risks. The United States must be in a position to continue to support those friendly and responsible Arab nations in whose security we have a stake and whose existence would be imperiled by more radical neighbors as they move to open direct negotiations with Israel. Having spoken of these three negotiating processes in different regions, all processes which are multilateral, all are complex. We're but one player among others, but in each our role is decisive. Let me comment briefly upon some lessons that one may perhaps draw from these talks if we are to successfully pursue peaceful settlements. We are peculiar people when it comes to negotiation. I guess all nations are. We bring our own cultural traits to our tasks of diplomacy. But when bargains are struck between American companies or American unions or American political parties, a measure of trust and confidence is usually assumed. We rely very heavily upon persuasion. There is an honorable tradition of splitting the differences. We tend to believe that if men of goodwill can just sit down at the same table, even the most intransigent, intractable problems can be resolved. We need a more multifaceted perspective if our regional negotiations are to bear fruit. Our recent experience in these areas that I've spoken of suggests some lessons that will make our diplomacy more effective. Henry Kissinger once said, "The art of diplomacy is not to outwit or to dupe the other party, but rather to persuade it of the existence of converging interests, or to convince it that the persistence of an impasse in the bargaining will result in serious penalties." And put another way, diplomatic progress requires inducements that are both positive and negative. We need carrots and sticks. Gestures of flexibility by the Sandinistas have materialized in response to international internal pressure. one of the reasons why the Nicaraguan democratic resistance deserves our support. We're strengthening our relations with Mozambique and Angola as carrots to encourage their participation in the South African search for peace. In the Middle East, our foreign assistance programs for Israel and Egypt and others are complementary to our diplomatic efforts to nudge the search for peace along. The second thing I believe we need to bear in mind is that we should not expect immediate results in these kinds of negotiations. Things normally take a lot longer than people expect. I guess that's one of Murphy's secondary laws. We Americans tend to be impatient. We're a can-do people. We believe that it's better to get immediately down to cases rather than to avoid contentious issues or to put off the attempted resolution until conditions have ripened. We sometimes tire of problems before the potential for their resolution has matured. We're anxious to achieve rapid results, not least because our political leaders face insistent pressures from the Congress and the public. By contrast, the Soviet Union or the clients of the Soviet Union have no such legislative pressures to worry about. They can take their time. They know the advantages of patience and persistence when dealing with us. We should recall the slow but steady progress that has been made toward a resolution of regional conflicts in southern Africa, where there have been few negotiating deadlines and relatively little media attention. In fact, I suspect one of the questions that we now have is whether, with the spotlight on those issues, our negotiators will be under a different set of pressures and will find the bargaining becomes much more difficult. We tend sometimes, indeed, to overlook the value of the negotiating process itself. Active U.S. mediation, even if it doesn't produce immediate results, puts us at the center of events and forces the contending parties to take our interests into account. Therefore, the very process of brokering is an alternative to confrontation and violence, even if there's not rapid or binding resolutions of underlying problems. The third suggestion I would make is that in dealing with tough regional issues, we shouldn't allow others to abandon their own responsibilities while shifting the burdens onto our shoulders. Put another way, we shouldn't let others assume we have a stronger stake in agreements than they themselves have. The regional realities are such that any lasting solutions in the Middle East or Southern Africa or Central America can only be achieved by the people who live there. We can help, but we cannot by ourselves solve those problems. In Central America, we should continue to do all we can to support and encourage the Cotadora process. In Southern Africa and the Middle East, likewise, we're encouraging the governments and groups to be flexible and imaginative. Fourth, we have to learn to tolerate ambiguities. We must face the fact there are no easy answers, nor permanent fixes to issues as complex as these. In Nicaragua, we should recognize the utility of maintaining contact with the Sandinista government while at the same time supporting, to the extent we can, the democratic resistance. Similarly, as I've said, we talk to the Angolan government, which we do not recognize. We maintain contact with UNITA, that internal resistance movement in Angola, which is a legitimate indigenous opposition group, while maintaining formal relations with neither of those parties. We must also recognize the need to live with a certain degree of complexity. No negotiation exists in isolation. At play in all these situations are the global interests of the United States, the needs of our allies, the domestic realities of the parties that are directly involved. In Southern Africa, a negotiation that ends violence between Mozambique and Pretoria is directly relevant to the pace of internal change within South Africa. Regional negotiations also represent an element in our wider global strategy. If we are successful, we'll reduce the room for maneuver of the Soviet Union. We must not let adversaries exploit our own domestic political system to deprive us of flexibility and the tools that are needed for effective bargaining. We shouldn't end up bargaining with ourselves, in short. Our continued support for those who are struggling for democracy in Nicaragua constitutes an essential bit of leverage for successful negotiations. There's another reason why we're hopeful that the Congress will be supportive. Finally, we should prize neither negotiations nor agreements for their own sake. reliability, and verification are indispensable elements. These are not merely technical issues. In the last analysis, states abide by agreements because those agreements serve their interests and reflect accurately the balance of forces at a particular time. Therefore, in designing agreements, we must assure that each party has the incentives to abide by them. Finally, I hope, as I've suggested, that bipartisan cooperation will be forthcoming. We certainly recognize it as an essential component of an effective diplomacy in each of these areas. These are lessons we're trying to put to use. I hope that you'll find them useful in thinking about our diplomacy in these key areas in the months ahead. You can be sure that we're pursuing every opportunity we see for the pursuit of peace. This is in the American tradition. But in our diplomacy, nothing can succeed without popular support. It's for that reason I was delighted to come here to open at least these issues for you, and now to welcome whatever questions you have. I thank you for your attentiveness. I'm pleased to be here. I'll take a crack at any questions you wish to throw. Thank you very much. With regard to the first part of the question, if it was clear that the United States was not going to invade or attack Nicaragua, as I think is certainly a fair statement, then the question has been why Nicaragua, after 1979, went through a massive buildup of its own military forces. They now have roughly 120,000 military forces. Costa Rica, its neighbor, maintains no armed forces. They have only a small marginal police force, and therefore looked at in the context of the regional states. The size of the military establishment in Nicaragua vastly exceeds any defense requirements and has placed in disequilibrium the regional balance. Obviously, that gives pause to neighboring countries when the government of that nation proclaims what it calls a revolution without borders and actively provides supplies, logistic support, and a command structure on its territory for insurgent activity against neighboring countries. That is the problem. Now, you ask, and I think fairly, what's wrong with the Kerry proposal? Quite apart from the fact that you'll understand that the executive branch is not keen about independent negotiations with foreign governments by individual senators, the fact is that the process of negotiating these security provisions was proceeding, as I said last summer. It was directed at limitations on advisors, limitations on bases, reduction in the size of military establishments through negotiation, a cessation of support for other insurgencies. We felt, as I mentioned in my remarks, that the draft treaty was deficient with respect both to the verification procedures and with respect to the timing for implementing those various provisions. For example, even the negotiations about the size of military establishments was not to begin for some months after the advisors were to have been withdrawn. What our Central American friends were concerned about was that a piece of paper would be signed, support for them would dry up, people would forget about the region, Nicaragua would be able to maintain its armed forces and its surreptitious support for neighboring insurgencies, and after the focus of attention had shifted to other areas, they would be susceptible, subject to the same kind of pressures of a military sort that faced them now. We were seeking to remove those imperfections in the draft treaty, and it was for that purpose that we were engaged in talks with the Nicaraguans at Manzanillo. As I said, after November, with the completion of their election, and perhaps our election, we saw a massive increase in the military supplies by the Soviet Union to Nicaragua. I presume this was directed at putting in place the kind of capacity to militarily deal a decisive blow to the Contras. And we saw little interest in in the substantive exchange about the Contadora Treaty. That is, what they said was, we'll sign the treaty as it exists in September, but we don't want to talk about any changes. And so it was at that point we felt the collateral aspects of those negotiations, fear among our friends that we were cutting a deal at their expense, represented costs of the direct negotiations out of all proportion to the substantive exchange which we were getting out of the Nicaraguan government. At that point, we said, we'll suspend Manzanillo talks, and let's put the ball back into the Contadora court, which has been done in the hope that the Mexicans, the Colombians, the Venezuelans, the Panamanians would themselves intercede with Nicaragua to promote further refinement of the draft treaty. And that, of course, is the process which we're encouraging. It was that objective which animated the talks in April among the Contadora countries. That will be resumed in mid-May. We have said, the President indicated to Senator Dole, that we're prepared to go back to Manzanillo. We also feel that that dialogue between the government and its opposition is a relevant subject for discussion. After all, the question is, why has the government of Nicaragua refused to talk to its own opposition? Provision for dialogue and reconciliation was one of the elements of the treaty which they said they were willing to sign. They have pledged themselves to the OAS to democratize the country. So we're not asking them to do something they haven't already undertaken a legal obligation to do. And we believe, as I said, that some pluralism in that society is a basic necessary attribute for compliance with the kind of settlement we're seeking. So we're ready to go back to talks, but we also feel that there's ample reason to support those who share our values and are seeking to open up the political process in that country. The question was, what are we doing 10 years after the end of the Vietnam War to resolve differences with Hanoi, to resume diplomatic relations, I take it, establish some economic programs with them, and so forth. And I was saying that the problem we face there is, again, they've got military forces numbering nearly 200,000 in a neighboring country in violation of that nation's neutrality and independence. And we think it would be a mistake to establish normal relations with them pending the withdrawal of those forces and the settlement of the Cambodian problem along lines that a vast majority of United Nations members have endorsed. We have not seen evidence as yet that they're prepared to contemplate that withdrawal. They regularly announce troop reductions, but when we inspect them closer, they turn out to be regular rotations that occur every spring. So we're not prepared to normalize relations in the absence of the withdrawal of their troops. Now, we have placed a great emphasis upon return of MIAs and POWs. And again, in the case of Hanoi, as in Havana, the problem is not one of communications. We see the virtue in having some discussions with them. And we have discussed orderly departure programs for refugees. We do discuss the MIA question. We have sought, however, to detach the humanitarian issues, like MIAs and POWs, from the broader issues of peace in the region. Not least because we don't wish to see the Vietnamese attempting simply to use the bodies of our former servicemen as bargaining chips with us. It's a gross and crass way of doing business. But we have indicated to them, in the absence of satisfaction on the MIA POW issue, there could never be the political climate in this country that would provide a basis for a more amicable relation. And we have seen some evidence recently that they're prepared to allow at least technical teams to come in for site surveys of crash sites for B-52s. They have turned over some additional remains. They have indicated a willingness to have more regular discussions and to allow technicians to come in for talks. But on the broader question, as I say, pending their withdrawal from Cambodia, we would not foresee diplomatic recognition nor certainly economic programs. Was the question understood? I guess the question is, are we making the same mistake with the PLO that we've made on all other international issues, failing to put ourselves in the others' shoes? And wouldn't we be better off if I interpret the question accurately, by recognizing the need to do something with the PLO without requiring them first to recognize Israel and acknowledge the relevant UN resolution. Well, my view is, our view has consistently been that you're unlikely to make progress in negotiation when the parties don't recognize the right of the other to exist. And that seems to us a fair basis on which to get talks started. This framework agreement of February 11th did represent perhaps some movement forward. There was an agreement that the parties would negotiate on the basis of UN resolution. But again, it begs the question. It's too cute. We think there's no reason not to be explicit on this particular issue. And perhaps the movement that has occurred recently, with a little patience, can be translated into the kind of movement which will permit the parties to sit down at the table. You can't resolve this problem until the parties can confront each other face to face. And it seemed to me the fundamental recognition of the reality of the other's existence is the basis upon which the direct discussion can get underway. So we're hopeful there's a little movement. We haven't seen the satisfactory evidence of that as yet. Yeah, I guess the comments were, to go from the last to the first, that the Nicaraguan buildup may perhaps be understandable in the light of Grenada, that is the Nicaraguan buildup. Second, why did the administration not respond more positively to recent Russian arms control proposals in the area of nuclear testing and moratorium on INF deployment? To take the latter first and very briefly, the fact of the matter is that for a couple of years after the Sandinista revolution, the United States provided more assistance than all other countries combined to Nicaragua. So the idea that the United States started with an attitude of extreme hostility toward Nicaragua simply just doesn't hold up to careful scrutiny. And again, the buildup began at a time when our relations were scarcely hostile. On the contrary, we were providing substantial aid. We ceased doing that in 1981 because of the way in which that aid was being utilized that is, the way policies were being directed against Nicaragua's neighbor. As for the arms control proposals, the nuclear testing proposal, we have resisted comprehensive test ban on grounds we don't think it's verifiable. We agreed in 1975 or 74, I guess, to a threshold test ban which was susceptible to technical means of verification from our national territory. Since the negotiation of that treaty, we have perceived that our technical means were not as adequate as we had thought, but we've been making progress on that. We've asked the Russians to come over and join us in improving the kind of verification that would permit the ratification of the threshold test ban. But verification compliance is fundamental, it seems to me, to securing confidence on the part of our people that you can enter these kinds of agreements. Secondly, on the INF moratorium, what they were saying is that they would stop what they call countermeasures if we would stop our INF deployments. The countermeasures were things they have done in Eastern Europe, which are unrelated to the basic thing which provoked our deployments in the first place, namely the establishment of SS-20 bases. And those they continue to deploy. The moratorium proposal that Mr. Gorbachev laid on the table recently mirrored what they had put down in the Geneva talks themselves. There was an aspect beyond INF and START freeze that was mentioned by them, namely a freeze on strategic defense research. And yet in our private talks with Mr. Gromyko in Geneva in January, he himself acknowledged that restrictions on research activities are simply not verifiable. And therefore to put forward that proposal was to put forward something which they had acknowledged we could not rely upon our national means of verification to enforce. So we thought it was a propaganda proposal. It was primarily directed at the Europeans and represents an effort by the Soviets in this opening phase of negotiation to use the public proposals to drive a wedge between ourselves and the Europeans. And again, it's only through the successful resistance of that kind of tactic that you can test whether or not you can make some substantive progress through the direct negotiations themselves. This was more for public diplomacy and for support of a diplomatic strategy than it was designed to move the talks forward. Well, with respect to the congressman, I wasn't expressing disdain for them personally. I was saying that you wouldn't expect an executive branch, which is charged with the conduct of foreign policy, to welcome private ventures in diplomacy at a time when we're trying to conduct sensitive negotiation, which does make it into a process in which we're negotiating more with ourselves than with others. Second, I would say that it's not, I think, correct to say that Congress has repudiated or opposed the administration's plans. In the first place, you can't call this covert aid when it's being discussed every day in the Congress and blasted all over the newspapers, as it has been for months. But in any event, the results to date have been support by the Senate for the administration's proposal, and a process of several votes. I frankly haven't caught up with the latest votes in the House this afternoon. The first vote was an up or down vote on the original resolution, which was expected to lose. But there are other resolutions, and I've not heard the vote on the Barnes-Hamilton resolution or on the Michael resolution, nor am I aware of whether the latter has even come up for a vote as yet. But what we would suspect is that the Senate will wind up supporting. The House, I suspect, will support some modification, and then there will be presumably a conference to work out the difference. As for private groups, clearly it's necessary for any private groups engaging in activities in foreign countries to obey the law. At the same time, we don't prevent expressions by private American groups or private individuals from expressing their support for the values which we all, I think, share as Americans. But there is there are neutrality laws and there are arms export control laws which clearly have to be abided by.
In order to keep with our tradition of ending promptly, that'll have to be the last question. Mr. Secretary, your presentation certainly was careful, and we appreciate your interesting commentary on diplomacy, and certainly your answers to questions were full and ample. We appreciate very much your spending the evening with us.